After Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution in 1989 peacefully ended communist rule, Prague became a mecca for thousands of young Americans. Many came to enjoy life in one of the world's most picturesque and inexpensive capitals. Some came to open businesses as Czechoslovakia began encouraging private enterprise. One success story is the partnership of two young men from Montana. Tom Brokaw, now in Prague with President Clinton, is here to tell their story. Good morning, Tom.
Good morning, Sarah. Well, Prague really, for this generation of Americans, is kind of the Paris of the 1990s. And the two young men that you're about to meet have discovered that beer and capitalism do go together.
29-year-old Glen Emery, a petroleum engineer, came here to drink beer, meet girls, and get away from school in Montana. John Bruce Shoemaker was a freelance journalist from Montana, cruising the East European Revolution when he landed in Prague. Glen's first bar, called Joe's, was an instant hit with young Americans for its cheap beer, Mexican food, and access to Prague's other sybaritic attractions.
It's everything that you're looking for in youth. You know, it's dynamism, it's fun, it's sex, it's rock and roll.
All that comes together in their underground nightclub, which looks like a scene out of Berkeley in the 60s. The club is in the basement of one of Prague's most famous buildings, where the modern Czech Republic was born 75 years ago. Emery and Shoemaker also own a large restaurant on the building's Art Nouveau first floor, and two other popular bars nearby. These two unlikely entrepreneurs are teaching a new generation of Czechs how capitalism works, but they're always fighting the leftover Bolshevik bureaucrats.
Well, we got this far, so it's encouraging, but it's frightening. Like, I think most of the time I'm afraid.
But are you afraid you can lose the whole thing through the bureaucracy, that any day they'll wake up one morning?
I'm afraid of bribes, and I'm afraid of the anti-Western sentiments as regards this building.
Are you making money?
Yeah, just now.
Just now starting to make money.
But the other thing is we've only been doing this in this space for 9 months, so that's pretty good to start to move into profit. And
we started with zero.
I had $600 when I came here. You had what, 800 or something?
Well, I came up with 800, and then it all went, and I ended up starting with more or less zero. He started with zero too.
Do you want to stay in the business for a long time?
If I stayed in this building, yes. If not, we've invested in a couple shares of the Russian oil company. We'll head out to Vladivostok and or down to Sofia for new adventures. But it's this building, right? This is something that I could never be a part of anywhere else in the world.
Do you guys feel like a couple of pioneers in the new world of capitalism?
Our company is called Lewis and Clark Expeditions, actually. East European Division.
Sorry, it's not all about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Tonight on NBC Nightly News, we'll be introducing you to some serious literary-minded Americans who have started a literary quarterly here and an old-fashioned coffee house that does look like a scene out of the Paris of the 1920s. So I'll see you tonight on NBC Nightly News. All
right, Tom, we will see you then. In the meantime, we're back in a moment with more on Today right after this.
It's a dream for a lot of university students doing Europe, traveling overseas, seeing the sights, drinking in the history. But for four young Canadians who've gone to Czechoslovakia, a very different goal. Not backpacking, but business. CBC's Steve Fisher takes us to the streets of Prague now to see how they're doing.
For 24-year-old Rob Frederick, it's like coming home. His family fled Czechoslovakia and moved to Toronto when he was a child. Now he's back, one of a group of four Canadians who set up a small company involved in a number of business ventures, including computer sales.
In Canada, most of the businesses are already taken up. The competition is incredibly fierce. And the capital needed to start something of this, I guess you'd say, magnitude. It's just incredible. And I would have never been able to do that in Canada.
His partners include Tony Hasek and Jean Wagner, both 24 and from Toronto, and Glen Emery, 26, from Vancouver. Altogether, they might have 2 years of business experience in Canada, but they're brimming with confidence.
I'll make it here because I know that when I'm thirsty, I should be able to buy a drink. Every day I'd walk down the street and I had 1,000 ideas of things that simply I took for granted in Canada, and here there weren't any.
Others are not so confident. Since the revolution, only about 60 Canadian firms have registered as businesses in Czechoslovakia, and only a handful have actually set up shop. The four have provided advice and encouragement to other Canadian companies, big and small, that are considering investing in Czechoslovakia.
They come here, the first day they have a nightmare with the telephones. The second day they have a nightmare with their accommodation. The third day they try to go directly to a place in the government to find somebody. He's not there and nobody knows where he is. And this happens for the whole time that they're here, and they go home. And we've seen it happen 100 times.
Canadian industry, writ large, probably hasn't been as active here as they could have been or should have been.
Ross Miller is with the Canadian Embassy in Prague, helping Canadian entrepreneurs get started in Czechoslovakia.
In telecommunications, in retail services, there are just so many things that have to be changed, and so there seems to be a plethora of opportunities. And I would think, particularly if you have the language background.
Rob grew up speaking Slovak at home in Toronto. It's a language similar to Czech. He's putting it to good use in Prague. The language is so difficult to learn, Westerners who are fluent in Czech or Slovak are rare. Rob's company has sold computers to about a dozen firms so far. Rob is the computer hacker of the group. He gets the machines up and running and provides follow-up training.
Because I grew up in Canada, it seems that I have more of an intuitive knowledge as to what a consumer may want from a company. Servicing, being always there for the customer, directing my company towards the customer's needs. Here in Czechoslovakia, they still have to learn that.
Tony Hasek and Gene Wagner are the sales team, making cold calls and follow-up visits.
It's not like they're used to people phoning them up all the time and asking for an interview for their time. They, basically, they're not sick of it yet. And so we have a great opportunity to get in there and get time from people in important positions in their companies.
But there are disadvantages as well. A currency so devalued, few can afford high-priced Western goods, an old, unreliable phone system, and after 40 years of communism, a poor understanding of Western business principles. The four young Canadians have already learned a few hard lessons. An attempt to market T-shirts failed, and they've run into bureaucratic nightmares trying to export Czech-made goods to the West.
I call it the favor bank here, and you have to, in order to get some things done, you have to do things for other people and you have to know people. And if you don't have friends in a country like this, you can't get anything done.
See if they can just level it off a little bit on both sides.
Despite setbacks, Glen Emery is now working with one of their Czech friends to get a new project off the ground. They've leased this old laundromat in Prague. With financing from an American partner, they'll soon install a number of new machines.
This is going to be the first automated laundromat in Czechoslovakia, maybe in Eastern Europe, I don't know, but in Czechoslovakia for sure.
While the four may not yet be rich, they are at least almost debt-free. They pay $30 a month rent for their computer store. They keep only a small inventory on hand and demand cash up front on all sales. Most of the money earned is put back in the business. Each draws a minimal salary.
My name is Tony Hasek.
This is the stuff that they're not allowed to export to Canada.
But then again, they don't need much. Beer, food, rent, and just about everything else here is still cheap by Western standards. All four are committed to a long and prosperous stay in Czechoslovakia.
I'd like to grow with the country. It's incredible. I've been here 2 years, and I've already seen so much growth. I've seen the country change, and I find that just being a part of it is an incredible experience.
For News Magazine, this is Steve Fisher, CBC News in Prague, Czechoslovakia.
Earlier today, we called Rob Frederick at the computer store in Prague just to check in. He says the computers are selling better than ever, and they're gearing up for the grand opening of the laundromat on October the 12th.
It's 20 years since the velvet flooded over the golden spires of Prague and draped Czechoslovakia in a bloodless revolution. In the aftermath of the fall of communism came the adventurous. Backpackers, hippies, hedonists, artists, musicians, actors, and the curious, all gagging for a taste of that infamous bohemian lifestyle. This influx of minds, coupled with the total freedom a post-revolution city ensured, led to Prague being labelled the left bank of the 90s. One man did more to put this title in its place than any other. On the anniversary of the 20th year since the fall of communism in Czechoslovakia, I caught up with Canadian and legendary publican Glen Emery. We talked about Glen's new book, Thirsty Dogs, which for the first time lifts the lid on what it was really like during the 90s in Prague. So Glen, tell me about your new book and why you decided to write it.
Well, because a number of reasons. I mean, I thought it would be good to, after being here for 20 years, it would be good to have something to take away from Prague other than just a beer belly, a hair loss problem, and a huge hangover. So, and it's a big historical period. The post-communist, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the fall of the Iron Curtain, and there was a bunch of us who came here right after these events, these historical European events, or world events, I guess, and we came here. We started a lot of the businesses that became really famous, and created a scene that became internationally famous. Was spoken about in the international press, in the media, and all sorts of interesting people came through over the years. It was a really, really fun, interesting, exciting, dynamic time. And I had all these stories that I've been retelling for years, and so I've actually tried a few times to sit down and put the story onto paper, and I was having such a hard time with it that I left it 2 or 3 times. I tried and just left it, but then one day I was in a pub with a bunch of friends who just sort of we all ended up there by accident. There was like 10 of us, and we were all people from that era, maybe a couple of newer people. And we were telling stories, and then and somebody reminded me of a story, so I told a story, and I had to go to the toilet, and I was trying to get to the end of the story so I could, have a break and go to the toilet. And I finished my story, and everybody was laughing so hard, and I was laughing, and I went to the toilet, and I was standing there at the urinal, and I was looking at the wall, and I was thinking, well, hell, if you can write down the story the way you just told it in a pub setting, and made everybody piss themselves laughing, then you're onto something. So I went home that night, in fact, after a few more beers, and I tried to write down that story that I told. And the next morning I opened up my computer and read it back to myself, and it actually read quite well, and it was funny, even on paper it was funny, and it worked. And so I just started compiling these stories, and I got about 60 now, and I've and made it sort of a collection of short stories. There's nothing really tying the stories together at all. It's just a collection of short stories, pub stories that I've been retelling for years and years. So,
having read some of your book, how do you think the reaction will be to your candid and honest appraisal of what I would describe as the Wild West years here?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think that yeah. I mean, I am candid and maybe a little irreverent. But I think that also the reader appreciates. I mean, as a reader, I appreciate when somebody's being honest, and I'm trying to be as honest as possible. And one of the ways that I overcame this notion that maybe I should watch what I say was the first thing that I said to myself was, well, my mother is not going to read this. So I put that in the back of my head, and then I basically wrote everything down the way it was, and yeah, I might be politically incorrect, and I might be saying some things that'll piss some people off, but if I drop off a few people's Christmas lists, I'm not going to cry about it. And the main thing is that if you can't be true to you got to be true to the story, and otherwise it comes across as being a bunch of bullshit,
So the name of the book is Thirsty Dog. Where does the name come from? Is it from your appetite of Czech ale, or what?
It's Thirsty Dogs, and one of the subtitles is The Left Skank of the 90s. It comes from one of the bars that one of the pubs that we owned in the Obecny Dom, in the Municipal House of Prague, which is this beautiful, huge Art Nouveau building on Republic Square in the Old Town. We ended up taking over the left-hand side of it for about 2 years and ran it and ran clubs and pubs and bars and restaurants and cafes, and there was this huge complex, crazy. And it was sort of like the cornerstone of the whole, that whole early 90s euphoric, era was all centered around that place. And around the back there was a pub called the Formanka, which we took over, and one of the guys who was working for us, Joe Earlywine, who we called Joey Knuckles because he used to be a boxer, he called it the Thirsty Dog, and we just said, that's fine, that sounds like a good name to us. And then subsequently, a few months after we opened it, that was the first place we opened, I think. We opened that, and then we opened the cafe, and then we opened the club. But the Thirsty Dog was opened first because it was pretty much ready to go. We just built a bar and put in some taps, and it was done. Yeah, and after about 3 or 4 months, Nick Cave showed up in town and was playing back-to-back gigs at the Lucerna because he sold out the first one. So we played a second one in the Lucerna in the Lucerna Big Hall, in fact, which must hold 4,000 or 5,000 people. And for the whole 2 or 3, 4 days that he was in town, he was drinking in the Thirsty Dog. He was just hanging out in the back room there with a few of his pals, getting drunk. And he ended up writing a song called The Thirsty Dog. And it's all about the pub. It talks about the Americans standing at the bar and da-da-da-da. And yeah, and so it's as a title for the book, it's fine because it's, a lot of the stories are about drinking and about the sort of hedonistic era in the early 90s, and that's basically what was going on, was a lot of thirsty dogs running around.
As you say, the book is a collection of short stories. Do you have a personal favorite story in the book?
Actually, yeah, my personal favorite is a story that happened to me in the Klondike, and it has a connection to Czechoslovakia, and it was just a weird thing that happened to me, where I was driving out of the bush, and I pulled in, and we were way out in the bush, like 50 kilometers up some dirt road in an old mining district where we had to ford a couple rivers to get out and onto the main highway that goes to Whitehorse. And the first town that we'd pull into was a town called Carmax, and it was just a small village, 300 people plus an Indian reservation on the other side of the river. There was a few more hundred people, and I pulled in because I had to drive south to Whitehorse a couple hundred kilometers or 150. And I was checking the truck out because the 4x4, because it hadn't been out of the bush for a few weeks. So I popped the hood and I was checking the oils and I was checking the tires and pumping the gas and filling up the tank. And as I was washing the front window, I saw some movement by the tanks, and I thought somebody was like watching me or spying on me. And I paid no attention. And then I saw it again, and I was like, hang on, there is somebody there. And then I looked and I said, hello. Then I saw this guy start to come out from behind the tanks, this really short guy with like a black hat and ringlets like this coming out of his hat. And he was wearing a black suit with a white shirt. And as I said hello, and he's like, hello. And he started to come out from behind the tank. And as he came out from behind the tank, I saw that he was dressed like this Hasidic Jew, basically. And I came from Vancouver, but I'd never ever met any Jewish people before in my life. I'd just seen him on television or something. And all of a sudden, here's this guy, and I said hello, and he's like, what are you doing? And I said, I'm coming from Mount Nansen. I'm driving into Whitehorse, get some supplies. And I said, what about you? And he says, I'm just out for a walk. And he had this heavy accent, and I turned to him. I said, where are you from, anyways? And he steps up onto the island, where the gas pumps are, and he sticks out his chest and he says, I am a Czechoslovakian Jew. And I thought about it for half a second because I'd lived in Slovakia before and I still spoke some Slovak. And so I said to him very quickly, I said, no, dobrý den, ako sa máte? Like, good day, how are you? And he heard me say this in Slovak, in fluent Slovak. And his eyes started to bug out and his lips started trembling. And then he turned around and ran for the trees, I guess he thought that they'd found him after all these years. So But yeah, it's a cool story.